Some debts don't come with numbers, they come with names. Harrison Ford hadn't thought about Elijah Monroe in decades, but one quiet morning in Wyoming, a 30-second news clip brought everything back. A name, a folded flag, and a boy standing alone beside a coffin. That was all it took. Enough to break the silence. Enough to remind him of a promise he was never supposed to keep, but never dared to forget. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you find this story meaningful, don't forget to subscribe. The coffee had gone cold. Outside, Wyoming slept under a veil of stillness, just the wind brushing pine branches and a hawk tracing circles above the trees. Inside the wooden cabin, Harrison Ford sat alone at the kitchen table. The TV in the corner, old enough to have knobs, flickered grainy morning news through dust-speckled air. He wasn't really watching, just letting the sound roll over him like static. But then came the headline, "Elderly Veteran Dies Outside Closed VA Clinic." He glanced up. A photo appeared on screen, flag-draped coffin, mourners few. Then the camera cut to a boy, barely 12, suit sleeves too long, standing alone beside the casket. The anchor's voice was flat, a tone reserved for stories too inconvenient to feel. Elijah Monroe, 86, died outside a VA clinic in Pittsburgh yesterday. The facility was temporarily closed due to budget restrictions. That was all. 30 seconds, one life, no outrage. The next story queued up. But Harrison didn't move. The name, Elijah Monroe. He set the cup down slowly, staring at the screen. Then he stood, walked to the TV and lowered the volume, eyes never leaving the image. The boy's face. That name, Elijah Monroe. The sound of it cracked something open. Snow, gunfire, screams swallowed by wind. And the blur of bodies falling in a field that wasn't supposed to exist on any map. 53 years ago, Harrison wasn't playing a hero. He was filming a documentary in Korea, embedded with soldiers for authenticity. One morning, they came under fire, panic, dirt, bullets. He remembered the sudden weight slamming into him, then realizing it wasn't a bullet, but a man. Elijah Monroe had thrown himself on top of him as the explosion went off just yards away. They sat together that night, Elijah and him, under a tarp lit by distant mortars. Harrison had offered to send the man's story to the press. Elijah had laughed. "You just do your movie, Hollywood. If I get too old to carry this." He had pulled off his medal, placed it in Harrison's hand. "You keep it for me until I can't." Harrison had tried to give it back the next day. Elijah refused. "Keep it safe, just don't forget me." He hadn't. Now inside that silent cabin, he walked slowly to the mantel. A small wooden box sat there, untouched for years. His hands trembled, not from age, but from weight. He opened it. The medal was still there, dulled by time but intact. He picked it up, turned it over. The back still bore the inscription, "E.M. for gallantry." His throat tightened. The news anchor moved on. Talk of inflation, of celebrity weddings, as if Elijah Monroe hadn't just died in a folding chair outside a locked door, as if a man who gave everything could be filed under minor local interest. Harrison turned off the TV. The room was too quiet. He held the medal in both hands now, fingers brushing its edge, gripping tighter. This wasn't just about a forgotten veteran. It wasn't a clerical error. It wasn't some bureaucratic accident. No, this was the result of a decision. A budget cut past quietly. A piece of paper signed by someone who never fought, never bled, never carried another man's sacrifice for 5 decades. And that someone had a name. He knew it before he saw the letter, before the knock would come, before any of it. Because honor didn't die when Elijah Monroe fell. It was being buried again, piece by piece. And Harrison Ford had just remembered the promise he never meant to keep this long. The rain came in soft and steady, tapping gently against the tin roof of the hangar. Wyoming rain didn't roar, it whispered. It settled into the trees, the gravel, the wings of the old aircraft resting under the rafters like sleeping giants. Inside, the air smelled of oil and cedar. Harrison Ford stood alone, wiping down the fuselage of his de Havilland Beaver, each motion slow, deliberate, like he was polishing something more than just aluminum. He wasn't thinking about flying. He was trying not to think at all. That medal hadn't left his pocket since morning. He paused for a moment, hand resting on the wing, then leaned in and inspected a tiny crack in the paint. It had been there for years, but today it looked different. Today everything did. A noise broke the stillness, the crunch of tires on gravel. Harrison glanced up. A black government SUV was pulling up the dirt road leading to the hangar. A man stepped out, young, stiff-backed, suit too clean for this part of the world. He approached with the caution of someone who knew he wasn't welcome here. "Mr. Ford." The voice tried to sound casual. The man held out an envelope sealed in gold and red. The presidential seal glinted under the hangar light. "This is for you, It's been marked urgent. Harrison said nothing. He didn't take the envelope right away. His hands were still covered in oil. He grabbed a rag from the bench and wiped them off slowly without looking at the courier. Then he reached out and accepted the envelope. The man waited, perhaps expecting a response, a question. None came. Harrison simply nodded once, and the man turned and left. The SUV disappeared back into the trees. For a moment, Ford just stared at the seal. He didn't open it, not yet. Instead, he walked to a shelf against the far wall, past shelves lined with old flight manuals and yellowing maps. From behind a weathered toolbox, he pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. Its cover was worn, corners rounded by decades of use. He opened it slowly, flipping through pages filled with names, some scratched out, some circled, a few with notes in the margins. He turned to the M's. There it was, Elijah Monroe, written in his own hand, dated 1971. Next to the name, a note, gave me his medal, asked me not to forget. He stared at it for a long time. A voice called from the doorway. You gonna open that thing? It was Ray, the old flight manager who'd worked the hangars since before GPS existed. He leaned on the doorframe, arms crossed, a ball cap low over his brow. Harrison didn't answer right away. He tapped the envelope against the edge of the notebook, eyes still on Elijah's name. Did you know, he said quietly, that the medal he gave me, he earned it by shielding me from shrapnel? Ray didn't speak. He knew better than to interrupt when Harrison used that tone. I told myself I was just there to film, Ford continued, to observe, not to be part of anything. But when the sky lit up and men started falling, it didn't matter who was holding a camera. He finally looked up at Ray. They're not inviting me to talk about movies. No, Ray said. They're not. Silence fell between them again, thick and meaningful. Ray pointed his chin at the envelope. So are you going? Harrison didn't reply. He turned back to the notebook, pulled a pen from the workbench and slowly drew a thick circle around Elijah Monroe's name. Then he underlined it, twice. The ink bled a little on the old paper. When he finished, he set the pen down, folded the notebook closed, and finally looked at the envelope again. He didn't open it. Not yet, but he already knew what it would say. A request from the president, a meeting, private, no press, no records, a matter of national interest, it would say, a matter of honor. But honor didn't come sealed in envelopes, and the timing too perfect. The broadcast, the death, the silence. This wasn't a coincidence. Something bigger was moving. And somewhere deep inside, Harrison Ford knew this wasn't just about Elijah Monroe. It was about all the names in that book. The ones no one read anymore. The ones buried in dust and folded flags. And it was about a promise that had just come due. Trump Tower rose into the Manhattan sky like a monument to ego. Steel and glass wrapped in gold trim, polished until it blinded. Inside, the silence was colder than the marble underfoot. The elevator opened with a soft chime on the top floor, and Harrison Ford stepped out alone. No entourage, no assistant, just a man in a worn leather jacket, his boots echoing down a hallway lined with mirrors designed to reflect power back at itself. At the end of the corridor, two massive doors stood slightly ajar. Beyond them, a room lit low, the kind of room where decisions weren't documented, just made. Inside, Donald Trump sat behind a glass desk, fingers steepled, a glass of untouched water beside him. He looked up, wearing that same smirk he'd worn for years, the kind that said, I'm untouchable. Harrison, he said, standing halfway, hand extended, voice smooth. Appreciate you coming. Not everyone gets an invitation like this. Ford didn't take the hand. He walked in slowly, measured, and sat across from him. He placed nothing on the table, just his hands folded. Steady, Trump chuckled. Straight to business, I like that. He reached into a drawer, pulled out a sleek black folder, and slid it across the table. This is an offer most people wouldn't take a second to think about. Ford didn't touch it. Trump leaned in, lowering his voice to that familiar whisper he reserved for off-the-record conversations. Look, I know you've been pushing hard for that funding bill, veterans benefits, rural clinics, mental health resources. Noble. I get it, it plays well on camera too. No response. Trump continued, undeterred. But here's the thing, that bill, it's in the way, it clashes with broader restructuring, bigger vision. People don't like cuts, Harrison, but progress needs sacrifice. He tapped the folder. I'm asking you to step back, quietly, let it die on the floor, no statement, no fight, just silence. Ford's eyes narrowed slightly, barely. In return, Trump went on, $1 billion. Tax-free, piped directly into the Air Heritage Foundation. That's yours, right? Imagine what you could do with that. Restore old warbirds, fund scholarships for pilots. You'd be a hero again. Silence. You don't even have to endorse me, Trump added quickly as if that made it cleaner. Just disappear from the conversation. I'll handle the rest. No one gets hurt. Harrison exhaled through his nose, not a sigh, just pressure released. Trump leaned back. You've done your part. America loves you. You've played the hero so long. Take the win, Harrison. Take the comfort. Ford slowly reached into his coat pocket. Trump watched, perhaps expecting a pen, maybe a signature. But what emerged was something older, a tarnished military medal. Ford placed it on the glass table between them gently. Trump glanced at it, confused. Elijah Monroe, Ford said quietly. He earned that throwing himself between me and a blast that wasn't meant for him. Trump nodded absently. A hero, I respect that. But we're not talking about the past, are we? We're talking about what comes next. Ford's eyes sharpened. You're asking me to use someone else's sacrifice to excuse my silence, he said. Trump shrugged. I'm asking you to understand how things work. Don't hate the player, Harrison, hate the game. Ford looked down at the medal, fingers brushing its edge. There was a pause, a real one, long enough for Trump to think he'd won. Then Ford's hand closed over the medal, not protectively, deliberately. You think this is about politics, Ford said. It's not, it's about debt. Trump smirked. You'll lose, Harrison, your bill will die. The support, the donors, they'll vanish. You'll be a cautionary tale. Ford stood slowly, slipping the medal back into his coat. I've seen worse men with more power, he said. They all fall the same way, fast. He looked Trump in the eye. And no amount of glass, gold, or smoke will hide the fact that you tried to buy silence from someone who's been carrying voices for 50 years. Trump straightened in his chair. You walk out now, that's it. You don't come back from this. Ford paused at the door. You're right, he said. I won't. Then he left. No handshake, no deal, just the quiet echo of footsteps down a hallway full of mirrors, and $1 billion left sitting in a folder no one would open. The heat clung to the air like a warning. Late afternoon in Washington, and the steps of the Capitol shimmered beneath a bruised August sky. No banners flapped, no podium stood, just a single microphone on a rusted stand at the foot of the marble steps. No press release had gone out, no campaign had been launched, and yet the crowd had come. They came because Harrison Ford never called press briefings, and today he had. Reporters leaned forward under sweat-stained ball caps. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, arms crossed, medals pinned. Tourists lingered behind barricades, phones already raised. But when the door to the building creaked open, the murmurs stopped cold. Harrison Ford stepped out alone. No security detail, no assistant, no speech in hand. He wore the same jacket he always did, creased, weathered, familiar. His walk was slow, steady, as if each step mattered. And maybe it did. He stopped at the mic. For a moment. He said nothing. The wind pushed gently across the crowd, tugging at shirts, ruffling flags. Somewhere a bird called. Then Ford spoke. I was offered a request, he said, voice low but clear. A polite one, private, no press, no witnesses, a chance to walk away from a fight that isn't supposed to matter anymore. He paused. The silence leaned in. They said I was too old to make noise, that if I stayed quiet, they'd be generous. That silence at my age was respectable. He looked out over the crowd, eyes calm. They were wrong. The words fell like stones. He reached into his coat, pulled out a small, square recorder. I don't name people lightly, he said, but sometimes the truth doesn't need framing. Just as he lifted the device, a shout cut through the air. Lies. A man pushed through the side of the crowd, flanked by aides, jacket unbuttoned, face flushed. Donald Trump. He strode toward the stage, voice rising. This is a setup. He barked, fake news. Harrison's a good guy, a hero even, but this is theater. The crowd shifted, cameras scrambled. Trump climbed 2 steps, took the second mic. His finger jabbed the air. I never offered a bribe, I offered support. This story, it's twisted. Ford didn't move, he didn't interrupt, he just looked at him, then said quietly, you have a right to speak, but so do I. He held up the recorder, pressed play. Trump's voice, unmistakable, filled the plaza. 1 billion, Harrison, clean, through your foundation. No one needs to know, just step back. Let the bill die quietly. The words crackled like thunder through the amplifier. Then silence, no coughs, no whispers, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Trump's face tightened, his mouth opened but nothing came out. Ford let the pause linger, then spoke again. That was the offer, but it came with strings attached to silence, to surrender, to forgetting people like Elijah Monroe. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the same medal he'd carried since that day in Wyoming. I carry this not because I earned it, but because someone did, and he asked me to remember. He held it high, and they tried to buy it. Another pause, then I said no. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. Their stillness said everything. Trump stepped back, grasping for control. He's twisting it, he said, voice strained. I was trying to help. We've worked with veterans. He's making it political. Ford's gaze didn't waver. "You don't buy silence with money," he said. "You buy it with shame, and I won't carry either." He stepped away from the mic, letting the recorder drop to the wooden stool behind him. The sound it made was soft, but the echo would last much longer. Trump stood frozen, mouth half open. Ford turned without another word and walked back into the Capitol. The microphone buzzed for a moment, then went still. No music played, no camera panned away. The world had just heard the truth, unedited, undeniable, and the storm hadn't begun. It had arrived. The trailer sat quietly at the edge of Pennsylvania Field, its metal siding weathered by too many seasons and too few repairs. Inside, the hum of a small fan fought against the late summer heat. At a small table by the window, a boy hunched over a sheet of lined paper, pencil in hand, tongue pressed to the corner of his mouth in concentration. Elijah Monroe Jr. His shoes were too big, literally. They had belonged to his grandfather, leather scuffed, soles worn, the laces knotted and re-knotted by smaller fingers. He wore them anyway. The letter he wrote was simple, honest. "Dear Mr. Ford, I saw you on TV. You talked about my grandpa. Thank you for not forgetting him. I wear his old boots now, but they're too big. I don't know if I'll ever grow into them, but I promise I won't take them off. I just wanted to say thank you." Elijah, he folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and stared out the window. His mother's car wasn't back yet. She worked double shifts at the diner, most nights coming home too tired to talk, but she always smiled when she saw the boots. Across the field, a dust trail rose. A truck, old, brown, familiar. The boy didn't move. When the door knocked, it was soft. His mother answered it, apron still on, hair pulled back. She froze. The man standing there was older than on TV. Leaner, quieter. His presence filled the space without saying a word. "Harrison Ford," she breathed, more statement than question. He gave a nod. "No cameras?" she asked. He shook his head. "People don't come without cameras anymore," she said, arms crossed. Still, Ford said nothing. He looked past her toward the boy, who stood now just behind the kitchen table, eyes wide, hands frozen at his sides. Ford stepped forward, slowly, carefully. In his hand was something small, wrapped in a worn cloth. He knelt. "This belonged to your grandfather," he said. His voice was soft, almost gravel. "He gave it to me when I didn't deserve it. I've kept it safe, too long maybe." He unwrapped the cloth. The metal glinted in the low light. Elijah stared, breath caught in his chest. Ford didn't hand it to him. He looked at the boy for a moment. Then, quietly, he reached up to his neck and unclasped a chain. A simple one, no shine, no decoration, just a strong thread of metal aged by decades of skin and sweat and memory. He looped it through the metal, fastened it again, then gently placed it over the boy's head. The metal hung low against Elijah's chest. It looked too big for him, so did the boots, and yet somehow it fit. His mother wiped her hands on her apron. "Why?" she asked. "Why come all this way?" Ford stood slowly. "Because promises don't keep themselves," he said. He turned to go. At the door, Elijah called after him, "Mr. Ford." Ford paused, one hand on the frame. "I'll take care of it," the boy said. His voice didn't shake. "I'll keep it safe." Ford looked back and nodded once. Then he left. No photos, no speeches, just the sound of boots on wooden steps and a truck starting in the distance. Inside the trailer, the boy stood taller. The metal rested against his chest, heavy but not too heavy. He didn't cry. He didn't need to. The weight of memory had already found a new home, and for the first time in a long time, it wasn't being carried alone. It began as a whisper, just one link. No headline, no source, no explanation. A low-resolution video file dropped anonymously into the inbox of a small independent journalist known more for chasing local corruption than national headlines. The file was titled with 3 words, "They'll never know." At first, no one believed it. A grainy clip from what looked like an office security camera, 2 figures seated across from each other, one in a leather jacket, the other behind a desk. The image was dim, the voices muffled. But then the audio kicked in, and the world stopped spinning for just long enough to hear it. 1 billion, Harrison, clean through your foundation. No one needs to know. Just step back. Let the bill die quietly. Trump's voice, clear, calm, certain, then the phrase that would tear through the country like a lightning strike. "They'll never know." Within hours, the clip had flooded every corner of the internet. Newsrooms scrambled to verify. Politicians ducked for cover. The White House issued a rushed statement calling the footage doctored. A fake, a partisan smear. But it was too late, because the people didn't need verification. They heard it, and they knew. In barbershops in Texas, diners in Ohio, school hallways in Indiana, front porches in Oregon, something began to appear, one by one, quietly, consistently. Medals. Some were real, earned in war and kept in drawers for decades. Some were cardboard, hand-drawn by children. Some were just cutouts printed from the internet. all of them taped to doors, hung in windows, laid on dashboards. Each one bore the same handwritten message. Honor is not for sale, no marching, no slogans, just a symbol passed from one hand to the next, from memory to defiance. Reporters staked out Harrison Ford's cabin in Wyoming. They waited in vans, knocked on doors, asked neighbors for comments. Ford said nothing, no statement, no interviews. He didn't need to speak. The medal was gone from around his neck, its place on his chest empty now, and still, his silence rang louder than any broadcast. A few days later, another message appeared. Not on the news, not from Ford, a letter leaked from within, from a former White House aide, anonymous, brief but real. I was in the room when the offer was planned. I served this country before I ever wore a suit. I know what a bribe looks like, and I know a man who didn't take one when he could have. Attached was a photo, a grainy one. It showed a work desk, a shadowed figure, and a wooden object, a model plane, hand-carved, wings uneven, paint faded. On the wing, a note scribbled in black ink. I understand why you did it. No name, no address, just a gesture returned. Someone had taken a risk to let the truth breathe, and Harrison Ford had responded not with words but with wood and memory. The message was clear: I see you, I honor you, and I forgive you. That single act, the model plane, sent back in silence, sparked something deeper. This wasn't about politics anymore. It wasn't about who leaked the video or which side was right. It was about one idea, now spoken in towns big and small: we don't sell what was paid for in blood. Outside the Capitol, the medals kept coming, hung on fences, left on steps. A quiet army of symbols, all saying the same thing. We heard it, we saw it, and this time we're not looking away. The cemetery was quiet. No wind, no birdsong, just the hush that comes when the world knows better than to interrupt. Rows of simple white stones stretched across a field washed in golden light. The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the grass. In the center of it all, two figures stood still: Harrison Ford, and beside him, Elijah Monroe Jr. They stood before a grave that didn't need an explanation. The words carved into the marble said enough. Elijah Monroe, Sr., Staff Sergeant, United States Army, 1952-2025. He gave all. Ford reached into his coat and pulled out a small box. Not wrapped, not locked, just wood, darkened by time. He opened it slowly, revealing the medal he had kept for over 50 years. The medal was no longer shiny. Its ribbon slightly frayed, but it had been cared for, carried, protected. He looked at the boy. This belonged here the whole time, Ford said quietly. I was just too late in bringing it back. Elijah Jr. held out his hands without a word, not demanding, not even expecting, just ready. Ford placed the medal into the boy's palms. The boy looked down at it, his fingers closing around the edges. The weight surprised him. He nodded once. I'll keep it, Elijah said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll keep him with me. Ford stared at him, then crouched slowly before the headstone. He reached into his inside pocket and pulled out a photo. A black and white picture, curled at the corners, worn soft. In it, two young men stood side by side in a war-torn camp, one with a camera, the other in uniform. Both smiling, both alive. He placed it gently at the base of the grave, beside the medal now resting in Elijah Jr.'s hands. I never told anyone about this, Ford murmured. Not because I was ashamed, but because some debts don't belong to the world. They just belong to the ones who owe them. They stood in silence, no speech, no press, no monument, just a grave, a medal, a promise, and the quiet hum of a nation waking up. From far away, the rumble of truck engines began to rise, not loud, not angry, just steady. Convoy, dozens of old pickups rolling down back roads toward the Capitol. They didn't honk, they didn't wave signs, but on every hood tied down with rope or tape, a symbol, a medal, real or handmade, shining or scrawled in marker. The message was the same: honor is not for sale. In towns across the country, people stepped outside and placed their hands over their hearts, not in protest, not in defiance, but in remembrance of names forgotten, of promises broken, of one man who chose to carry what wasn't his until he could return it, and of a boy who had just accepted the weight of legacy. Back at the grave, Elijah looked up at Ford. Do you think I can carry his name right? He asked. Ford didn't answer right away. Looked out over the cemetery, at the rows of stones, at the sun slipping behind the hills. You already are, he said. Then he turned to the boy, his voice lower now. But remember, it's not about wearing his medal. It's about living what it stood for. Elijah nodded. They both looked down one last time. Ford placed his hand gently on the headstone, fingers splayed across the engraved name. Then he stood. No fanfare, no farewell. As they walked back toward the dirt path, the convoy rolled on in the distance. And across the nation, the chant that had never been shouted returned in silence. Hands on hearts, eyes closed. A whisper passed from porch to porch, state to state. We remember, the story didn't end in front of a microphone. It ended here, in a field, in the fading light, where the debt was paid, and a name began again. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.